Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Welcome. Thank you for being here. This is Watershed Moment, Envisioning Place-Based Futures. This project is a collaboration between Save Our Great Salt Lake and Utah Humanities, with funding provided in part by Salt Lake County Zoo Arts and Parks. My name is Emily. I am with Utah Humanities, and before my co-conspirator Chandler and I introduce this project, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the first peoples of these lands and waters. Utah Humanities has a land acknowledgement statement that is a bit lengthy, but feeds into this project quite naturally, and so I'm going to read it in full. Utah Humanities acknowledges Utah's indigenous communities as the original peoples of these lands. This extraordinary confluence of alpine mountains, salty deserts, and sinuous red rock are the ancestral homelands of the Ute, Paiute, Shoshone, Goshute, Navajo, and ancestral Puebloan peoples. These first peoples hold the entire landscape as sacred, not only for themselves, but for their ancestors, future generations, and humankind as a whole. We honor their stewardship, respect their resilience, and celebrate their traditions and living cultures. We honor the land and respect the kinship others hold for these landscapes. We foster respectful connection to Utah lands and First Peoples through our programming. Working in partnership with Utah's indigenous communities, we recommit ourselves to providing sustained opportunities for Utahns to understand systems of oppression, protect and honor memory, and preserve and support indigenous cultures. We call for a brighter future together, for people and the land, one human interaction at a time. Our mission at Utah Humanities is to strengthen Utah communities by cultivating connections, deepening understanding, and exploring our complex human experience. The humanities is the name given to this collection of disciplines that make meaning from our experience in the world. It is philosophy, history, the discussion of stories. How we make meaning of our world and our place in it determines the way we relate to each other, the way we relate to our environments, and the futures we build together. When it comes to climate change, a wicked problem that is intricately woven into social justice, economics, etc., the humanities play an important role in how we understand and respond to these issues. The stories we see flooded in the popular imagination are dystopian, apocalyptic, and full of despair. These stories are paralyzing. They leave those of us who long for thriving futures, all of us, with only a clear vision of what we don't want, as opposed to a vision of what we do want, of what we could have. It is like trying to piece together a puzzle using the picture from a different box and the instructions make a different picture. The poet Lucille Clifton wrote, "We cannot create what we cannot imagine." This project gives agency to all Utahns, youth, elders, natives, transplants, and all of the colors in between, to say, show us the world you want for your future generations. This event tonight serves as the launch for a larger project, an open call for submissions, inviting any and all Utahns to submit creative responses, writing, poetry, art, to the question, what does your watershed look like in 150 years if we respond to climate change swiftly and justly? In the end, we'll be compiling selected submissions into a booklet that is free and available to the public, a mosaic of visions for a just and place-based future. To launch that call for submissions, this panel will ground us in some essential truths about climate change, social justice, intersectionality, ethics, and the undeniable power of storytelling. To introduce her role in this and our panel, I'm going to welcome to the stage Chandler Rosenberg from Save Our Great Salt Lake.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. It has been an absolute blast to work on this with you. We've been dreaming this up for like over 6 months now, so it's really exciting to have you all here and to be launching this. Like she said, my name's Chandler with Save Our Great Salt Lake. Of course, our work with Save Our Great Salt Lake has been largely focused on the lake, but from the beginning, we've understood that it's much bigger than just Great Salt Lake. The crisis is really symptomatic of a much larger disconnection from water and from the natural world. I always like to say that the solutions for Great Salt Lake are twofold. So we have the short-term, immediate solutions we need, the technical things, the policy changes to get water to the lake ASAP, but then we also have these long-term changes that get at the root of the crisis, which in my view is this worldview that says that we can use and abuse nature and water however we please, that humans are separate, and that our lives and our health are not bound together with the health of the living world. So it's really a relational problem, a cultural problem. How do we see ourselves as humans embedded in places or not? So yeah, like I said, in the work for Great Salt Lake, it's essential that we consider the broader watershed, what it looks like to begin living within our means. And as a state, as a watershed, I think however we want to slice it, we've yet to really grapple with what it looks like to live in an arid region in the arid West. Utah is the second driest state in the nation, and yet we have some of the highest municipal water rates or water use in the country per capita, because our systems and our policies are not fit to the natural limits of our bioregion. Our lifestyles are disconnected from reality with our technology, our cars, our air conditioning, and by that I mean from our material reality, from the living world and the actual places in which we live. So I'm excited to explore this idea of place-based futures tonight and throughout this project. And I also want to briefly touch on this watershed moment that we find ourselves in. So of course we're talking about watersheds tonight as hydrological systems, what it means to live in one, and what a more grounded future within our watersheds could look like. But I also want to call attention to this unique moment in time. We're at an interesting place in the work for Great Salt Lake and for water in the West more broadly. On the heels of the 1,200-year mega drought, we got the historic 2023 water year, and a pretty good year this year as well. The moisture has been incredible. It's been very encouraging to see Great Salt Lake rise a little bit, but it's also created some challenges as some of our lawmakers and community have been lulled into complacency. Hopefully I'm not the first to tell you that this journey towards a restored Great Salt Lake, healthier watersheds, and a more sustainable future in the Great Basin is going to be a long and difficult one. We're going to experience drought again, likely very soon. And because of that, I think it's critical that amidst the urgency, the heaviness, and the despair, we also make space to dream and to imagine a more relational future for our communities, our watersheds, and our ecosystems. Our cultural contexts, our conditioning, or even just our fatigue, our day-to-day lives can limit our sense of what's possible, so we have to be very intentional about using our collective imagination to set our sights on where we really want to go, and then begin working our way there. So this is what we're hoping to invite with this project and this panel discussion tonight. So with that, let's get into it. I am really excited to introduce my friend Brooke. Brooke Larsen is a journalist, writer, and storyteller based in Salt Lake City. She is currently a fellow with High Country News, covering conservation, agriculture, and rural communities across the West. She also reports on water, climate, the energy transition, and labor. She frequently writes about issues at the Great Salt Lake, and she's currently producing the podcast Stay Salty, Lake-Facing Stories, which explores what it means to stay in the Great Salt Lake Basin as the lake recedes. Brooke is also the co-editor of the anthology New World Coming, Frontline Voices on Pandemics, Uprisings, and Climate Crisis, and a recipient of the High Country News Bell Prize. She received a master's in environmental humanities from the University of Utah, where she researched the role of story in movement building and climate justice issues in the Southwest. Before that, she studied environmental policy at Colorado College and researched land and water issues with the college's State of the Rockies project. Let's give it up for Brooke.
Thank you, Chandler and Emily, and thank you so much to everyone for being here this evening, and thank you to our amazing panelists. I'm super excited for this conversation. So I'm just going to start by introducing these folks, and then we'll dive into the conversation. So right next to me, we have my friend, Olivia Juarez, who is a lifelong Utahn based in Salt Lake City. They are the co-host of the podcast Stay Salty, Lake-Facing Stories, which I have the honor to work on with them. And if you haven't checked it out, we have an exhibit right now in the basement of the library that has all of the stories from the podcast. So you can check it out after this panel if you want. Olivia is also the public lands director for Green Latinos. They have nurtured Latino, Latina, and Latine joy and leadership in conserving public lands with other groups as well, such as Latino Outdoors and the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. They were recognized as one of 10 under 40 in 2021 by the National Parks Conservation Association for their commitment to creating safe, equitable access to public lands for Latino community health. Next up, we have Forrest S. Cuch, an enrolled member of the Ute Indian tribe. Forrest was raised on the Uinta and Ouray Ute Indian Reservation in northeastern Utah. Forrest was previously the education director for the Ute Indian tribe and the executive director of the Utah Division of Indian Affairs. He is the author of the book, A History of Utah's American Indians. He's also on the board of the Warm Springs Alliance, which is working to restore hot springs in northern Salt Lake, which were important to the Ute people and other tribes. Next, we have Dr. Bonnie Baxter, who is a professor of biology and the director of the Great Salt Lake Institute at Westminster University. Dr. Baxter's research focuses on the lake's extreme microbiology, especially the foundation of the ecosystem, the algae and cyanobacteria that feed the brine shrimp and flies. She has published the first academic book on the biology of Great Salt Lake and the first children's book about the lake. Bonnie Baxter has become a spoke scientist, which I love that term, explaining the water crisis at the lake to government representatives, the media, and the community. And then last up in our panel lineup, we have Thomas H. Bretz, who's an associate professor of philosophy at Utah Valley University, where he is also the environmental ethics fellow at the Center for the Study of Ethics. He is involved with various sustainability efforts on campus, and his research agenda is overall characterized by a concern with inclusive, just, and sustainable communities. Specifically, he investigates the possibility of norms and practices that allow for reciprocal relationships between and among humans and non-humans. I'm really excited to be up here with you all today. To start off, I just want to give you all a chance to share anything else that I missed in your bio that you want to share with everyone. And also, can you each share what watershed do you currently live in or call home? And I'll just start with you, Olivia.
Hey. Thank you all so much for spending your evening with us. I guess that I would add that I'm a person of these valleys. I grew up in Tooele, overlooking the Great Salt Lake every single day of my life. I live in Sugar House, and so my watershed is that which flows out of our Wasatch Mountains, that which springs out of the Ochre Mountains, and ultimately ends up back into the Jordan and other tributaries to Great Salt Lake. I'll leave it there.
Is this on? Okay. I grew up in the Uinta Mountain drainage system, and most of the water is ducted to the Wasatch Front. Most of my drainage. The Central Utah Water Project was proposed at a time when our people really did not understand the mechanics of water. We understood the importance of water, but we didn't understand how water can be utilized, piped, duct, whatever. We didn't understand hydrology. We had some people who said, don't negotiate, stay away, otherwise we'll lose more. And then there were more progressive folks like my father and the rest of my family who said, we have to stay at the table and negotiate. Consequently, we lost most of our water, okay? The perception was, well, you can replace your water with water from the Green River and Flaming Gorge. And of course, there is some irrigation water from the Uinta River and the White Rocks River, but the Uinta River is a powerhouse river. you need to know. Powerhouse, it used to flood the area every spring, and big floodplain. Nowadays, most of the farmers take most of the water right off the top. They have a canal system that pulls most of the water right out. So we hardly have any flooding anymore. And so our water situation is tragic. So I'll pass it on.
So I feel like I should be talking from the bottom of this watershed, the very bottom, because I spend a lot of time at the bottom thinking about what's coming down or not coming down this watershed that I share with the folks who live close to the lake. But also, I think it's important to realize this is one of the largest watersheds in North America. It's really enormous. So while I only really see its bottom, it's really enormous.
Hello everyone. I guess I'm kind of feeling that maybe in one regard I'm the odd person out in the sense that I'm not really from here or even from the region, as you can hear from my accent. I'm from Germany originally, and I grew up in the Rhineland, which is named after one of the largest rivers in Europe, the Rhine, and close to the Mosel River as well. And apart from those being very good wine regions, I do think that it was really kind of, I guess, a biocultural shock to move to the southwest of the United States, right? I mean, starting with the fact that it hardly ever rains here, which I'm now kind of used to, and I still own an umbrella, but it's more like an accessory. But where I grew up, but it rained all the time, and I think just moving has really made me reconsider, what we take for granted in terms of, bioregions and water and precipitation and bodies of water and things like that. And so I think maybe that's kind of what, my perspective would be on this in particular.
Thanks, everyone. I wanted to start there because I think as we're talking about this watershed moment and how I think going forward, something we wanted to do was, think about what watersheds we are in. And in Utah, we have the Great Salt Lake watershed, the Great Salt Lake Basin, and the Colorado River Basin, or the Colorado River watershed. So those are two of the main watersheds we'll be talking about today on the panel. And I just really appreciate you all sharing your piece of those places. So the panel today is also about imagining how we go forward, but to do that, I think we also have to look back to understand how we got to this place in the first place, and where we are even at in this moment. We just had 2 wet winters, which Chandler talked about, but I think it's fair to say we're not in the clear. Climate change is real in here. So I wanted to start out by just talking about what is our current crisis and what's the outlook for the next 100 years. And I'm going to pass it to Bonnie to start us off on this one.
Because I am the owner of a crystal ball.
Yeah, exactly.
I think if we just back up a couple years, the way we measure, the way we think about a terminal lake is in order to keep it at its happy range of elevations, we need to get the amount of water in, the same amount of water in that goes out. And the way we get water into Great Salt Lake is mostly from snowmelt that trickles down the watershed and fills the lake. And the way we get water out is only through evaporation, because there is no heading to the ocean like where I'm originally from on the East Coast. So it's that equation is really important, and you might get overwhelmed with the complexity of the numbers and what was that right elevation number again. But it's pretty simple to think about just making those numbers match, right? And so we did not do that for several decades. We were going down, 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 on an average of losing 6 feet per year since the 80s, since the high point of the floods in the 80s. So that was largely due to pulling too much water for diversions for other activities upstream, right? Development, industry, agriculture. So that was not then climate change. So now we're seeing the pressures of climate change, where we have hotter summers and where we have more precipitation in the form of rain. So that changes that equation, because rain rolls off the top of the ground quickly and it evaporates more readily than snow, which can trickle down slowly and recharge the aquifers, right? So getting more rain and less snow is not good for us, and higher temperatures earlier in the spring means the same thing. If you get a strong runoff really fast, it'll evaporate. So higher temperatures not good. Also, it increases the evaporation rate, so the rate of evaporation from the lake. So that's a long way around saying, where are we? So we went down, 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 and we ended up at this elevation that was the lowest elevation, 4188.6, if you care. But the lowest elevation that had ever been recorded at the lake. And that happened in the fall of 2022, in November. So always the high point is like May or the beginning of June, and always the low point is, after the evaporative hot summer season, right? So that's normal. So where are we right now? We're at the high point of this year, right? And we had this robust, crazy snow last year. And that allowed us to fill the lake almost 6 feet. But every summer we lose 3 feet of elevation to evaporation. So we got a +6. We were behind 11, by the way, to the happy place. We got a +6 minus 3, which is what? 6 minus 3 is 3, right? See how you can do that? So we ended up at the end of the year up 3. And the really good thing that isn't simple in the math is we also filled the reservoirs. So this year, the snow we got didn't have to first fill the reservoirs, it could trickle down. And so we're still getting some benefit from last year. I guess that's what I want to point to. So yes, the lake is up, and now we're up probably 6 feet from that low, but we're going to lose 3 feet this summer, right? So we're going to stay pretty stationary. We're going to be a little lower, I predict, than where we were at the end of last year, but we're still getting some benefit from last year. So next year is the year I'm worried about. And I think a lot of us that study these cycles are worried about that. So that's kind of where we are. Does that help?
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Does anyone else want to jump in on this question? Well, Bonnie, to get back to the other part of the question, what do you think the outlook is for the next 100 years?
100 years. Yeah. Okay. So when I first moved to Utah, I spent a lot of time hiking and backpacking and learning to love this landscape because it's amazing. And I remember when I would be down in the Southwest and I would go to a historic and sacred site like Hovenweep, the signs or the people, the rangers, would always say things like, 1,200 years ago, all these people left and we don't know what happened. We don't know where they went. They disappeared, this mysterious thing, right? Well, I can tell you there's lots of people who actually do know the stories about what happened, and those stories have been passed down in oral histories, and that's great, and you can tell me way more than that. But what's interesting to me is now we know scientifically what happened. 1,200 years ago, there was a mega drought. So folks that study this paleohydrology, so think paleontology, but now you're thinking about water, they study things like soil moisture signatures and tree rings to see growth in the trees at that time. And what we see in the Southwest is that every 1,200 years there's a mega drought, which means it lasts for decades. And that was 1,200 years ago. So we're currently in a mega drought, and our patterns of drought that we've seen over the last 15 years bear that out. It was predicted, and it's exactly as predicted. That is separate from climate change, and that is separate from water diversions that are causing problems in this terminal watershed. So for 100 years, you're going to make me answer that question, right? So the pressures are bigger. and the pressures are going to be stronger, and the system will not survive without intervention in the watershed.
Yeah, and I appreciate that response, Bonnie, that you also brought us to some historical context, right? Because that's where I want to kind of keep us on for one more minute here. How did we get here? So we're talking today about our water crisis, the drought, but as you just said, this isn't just drought, it isn't just climate change, it's also the water diversions, right? And as we're talking about imagination, I think it's important to remember that someone in our history imagined our current systems, right? And to be honest, it's my ancestors. My ancestors colonized this state, and they imagined our current systems, our current cultural relation with water, our current policies around water. And so I want us to talk a bit about what's the root of our current crisis, what previous relations to water were imagined 100, 200 years ago that shape how we relate to water today. And I want to pass this one first to Forrest to start us off.
First of all, I want to say the recent high water year we've had was kind of a blessing and a curse. It restored our lakes and reservoirs, but it also caused us to start relaxing. When we were struggling with that dry year, our consciousness, our awareness was going up. And we were starting to become concerned. We were considering conservation measures. We were taking it serious. But now that the water, our streams and lakes have been restored, it's caused us to relax. And I don't think we can do that. I think we need to take this time to really focus on our real problem is our culture. You see, I appreciate your comments about the Rhine River. I've been there. It's a beautiful river. But it goes back to, I've always thought that a lot of the people who came to this hemisphere, a lot of them came from places that were green and had lots of water and rain, plentiful rain. And they came to a climate that was very little rain, very dry. And I don't want to insult anyone, but I've heard the comment, well, we want to make the desert bloom. The desert already blooms, okay? What we need to do is put water in the places that it will be most feasible, okay? And we're not doing that right now. Where I come from, the Uinta Basin, I see them digging more and more pipelines, and they're piping more and more water out of the Duchesne River, which feeds the Colorado, okay? And the problem I have with that is that those lands are not, a lot of those lands are alkali desert. They're not really quality soil. And they're starting to go up along the bench lands, the cedar bench lands. Those lands are not designed for farming. And the worst thing is they're raising a lot of alfalfa, which takes a lot of water. And what they don't use for their own livestock, my understanding is the Utah Agricultural Association, they're shipping a lot of that to San Francisco to be put on barges to China. And if you really examine that closely, we're shipping our water to China, okay? Now, I'm a rancher myself, okay? I raise alfalfa, grass alfalfa mix, mostly for my horses. And I'll sell some from time to time, but I sell it locally. And so I'm conscious of water and how to preserve. In fact, my son talked me into going to a pivot. So next year I'm going to install a pivot. more efficient. So I'm doing my part, okay? So I don't know if that was the whole question.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah,
But we've got a cultural problem, folks. And it's going to be hard to change. It might even take another cataclysmic event for us to realize we've got to make some changes. And the indigenous people, you know, I used to think, they used to call us the caretakers and all this stuff. I used to think of my own people as backward. And people used to say, oh, you Indians are always getting in the way of progress. And that used to make me feel bad until lately I sat back and said, you know, lately some of the progress I see is not very good. In fact, it's destructive to the earth. And maybe it's a good thing that we get in the way of progress. That might even be our purpose. Who knows?
Yeah, I love that. How do we define progress, right? Does anyone else want to respond to that question of how we got here? What's the root of the crisis? Okay, well, I'm going to be turning it over to you next, so maybe you'll have something. So as you're talking about culture, and a root of culture are the stories we tell, right? So I'm curious what you all think about who has been excluded from mainstream stories about our relationships with our watersheds, and how we shift the stories we're listening to going forward. Will you start us off?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to riff off of what Mr. Cuch was just saying about a cultural problem that, you know, I've especially realized in my place, like really strongly rooted in Latino, Latina, Latine community organizing, is how like power and culture and story, they're so intertwined. And I want to ask y'all to reflect on like, what is culture? What makes culture? Who says what culture is? And that's in our power, that's in our hands, that's in our hearts. Like culture is what we make of it. And so I think, you know, the opportunity moving forward is to tell ourselves, to tell each other, to tell the world, like, this is who we are as a people. This is what we value as a people, not what you've been made to say or think about, like our values, but the things you actually see, the things you actually feel and share. And I truly believe that in my core, because it's like, you looked at me as a little girl. I was one of the very few Hispanic people in my school every year growing up. Then I decided I'm going to get into environmental conservation for my professional career. And for so many years, I was the only person of color in that room. I also didn't grow up LDS. I'm also queer. Like, there's a lot of things about my identity that don't make me fit the typical ideal thing about like what you think a Utahn is, or like who belongs to Utah culture. But I still feel like this is my home and these are my people, regardless of if you share any of these identities with me or not. And I really think that it's rooted in these lands and these waters. I truly believe like we all here across the state love and honor and cherish and want to make sure that nature is healthy and that it's well and it's always here to provide and give, and that we have a good relationship with it for all future generations. And I think that's really the bottom line thing about what defines being a Utahn and what Utah culture is. So that totally did not, not in my notes, but I appreciate where the conversation's taking us. It doesn't answer the question of like who has been excluded in defining like what culture is, what stories we tell, where power is. And as I like to think of myself more of a listener than a storyteller, especially in my role as like a podcast host. As a listener, for me, it's like the non-experts. It's the people who, like really great reporting coming from University of Utah students with the Great Salt Lake Collaboratives project. They talked to Tooele residents about their thoughts and experience with the recently approved auxiliary inland port that's going to be built out in Tooele County. And, you know, they just talked to a man who lives there who's concerned. And those are the stories that have been historically included. In order to be able to be somebody quoted by a journalist or invited to come onto the talk show or be on the panel, you have to have the credentials. But, you know, living here, being a person that says, this is how my life, my health is impacted, my kids' health impact, like, make those your credentials, make that your badge. And that's where I think power shift is going to come from, is including so-called non-experts and like really deputizing the expertise of community members' lived experience coming here or having been here for however long. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and it reminds me of something, Bonnie, you told me when I interviewed you a couple months ago for a story. You talked about the massive amount of calls and emails you get all the time, and you know, some of those are big, quote-unquote, expert important people, the USGS, the Rockefeller Foundation, these big people, but you said that's no more important than, I think it was like a grandma whose family grew up in Tooele and used to read or paint or something creative on their porch while looking out at the lake, and now they can't see the lake from there. And I just thought that was a really powerful story. I don't know if you want to speak to that or build on what Olivia was saying.
I think probably, I do a lot of public speaking about the lake, and I think one of my favorite gigs that I had last year that paid $0 was, or of any of them, was speaking to an assisted living facility. Someone who was their program director and also a resident called me and asked me would I come, and he said, we got a lot of people who are really concerned about the lake. And so I went, and it was a really big facility. There were 80 people at my talk, 80 people over 80. And it was the most unbelievable audience. I often ask, how many of you have been to Great Salt Lake? So right now, everybody raise your hand. How many of you have been to Great Salt Lake? This is so spectacular, right? So depending on where I give a talk, like I give a talk at Snowbird, like almost nobody's been to Great Salt Lake. They're here for the skiing, and you know. So it's super interesting, but every single person had been to the lake, and then they started telling me stories about, oh, I met my husband, I went on my first date with my soon-to-be husband out at Antelope Island banding gulls on Egg Island, and I was like, you're kidding me. And then I decided to get my master's in biology, this lady said, and she's 95. And she married this guy. She fell in love with him over birds. So that kind of story, like what that teaches me is that this lake is in the fabric of the people who live here. To your point, you live here, right? Even if sometimes you felt different or excluded or whatever, you are included as a Utahn. You said so. And people who feel that way feel like that lake is part of them. And when it was threatened, to Forrest's point, that made all of us go, what are we losing, you know? And so I think a lot of people started bubbling up these stories, and they started coming out. That's the way it felt to me. And I think that's why those stories have been so precious to me, to hear people who just want to stop me to tell me what the lake means to them is really, really special.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Thomas or Forrest, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, the question that comes to me is, can we change our culture? Is it possible to change culture? And my response is that, well, I did. I had to survive I had to give up being a little bit Indian and join the white folks' thinking, or I was not going to survive. What I did is I decided I would take the best of my culture and keep it, and then I would adopt the best of the dominant culture, okay? I would try to be a capitalist without becoming greedy and selfish. I would keep my connection to God the Father and Mother and nature, okay? And not become a preacher and preach to everybody what they should not to be, okay? So I took the best of both worlds. And I guess now I'm asking you folks if you could adopt a little bit of my culture. Some of my culture said, take only what you need. Only what you need. Share. You know, if one starves, we all starve. Okay? Another one would be stay connected to nature. Understand that everything in nature has a spirit just like we do. And you can talk to a tree. A tree doesn't have a mouth, but it does have a spirit, and you can communicate with a tree. You know, I went to Costa Rica. They even have trees that walk. They honestly do. They have trees that walk. In my world, the world is mysterious, okay? It's not black and white. It's checkerboard, and sometimes it'll change. The best way to explain that would be the dominant world is the world of science and linear sequential thinking. The Indian world is holistic and quantum. It operates in quantum theory, with very little rules here, if any. This world over here has lots of rules, physical laws. This one doesn't. A medicine person will say, oh, my prayer, I'm going to send it, and it'll be across the world in a second. I'm going to pray for someone over there who needs help. That's the quantum world. So my world is different. I mean, the traditional Indian world is completely different, except for 3 areas. I did a study in 1986. The only area we were common was a belief in God, a creator, the importance of family, and then the importance of tribe or community. Those are the only areas we were similar in values and beliefs. Everything else was completely different. Science, spiritual, linear, holistic, you know? Competitive, cooperative, on down the line. It's a different people. So I guess what I'm going to throw out to you folks is I want you to consider if you could consider adopting some of our ways, our beliefs. And just maybe we'll get in the way of some of this destructive progress. Like Senator Lewis, he said something about good trouble, or what was it, cause good trouble? Mm-hmm. And we just might be able to get through all of this.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, Forrest, because I think a lot of times when we talk about imagining new worlds or our way forward, we don't recognize what we can also learn from our past, right? And from indigenous cultures, that it's not just creating something new, but also revisiting what we we've lost or tried to get rid of that we need to bring back. So thanks for bringing that forward. I want to now pass it to Thomas to talk a bit about ethics. I'm curious what ethic you think we need to bring forward to bring this cultural shift forward, and how we relate with our watersheds and the communities they support. What can we learn from water?
Yeah, no, that's I guess one of the questions, right? How do we think about things differently? And maybe I start with piggybacking off what you said, Forrest, right? Seeing the world differently, and as you said, right, that doesn't mean that we need to reinvent something radically new. I mean, you just need to think about the fact, right, that a lot of the indigenous cultures that are still here lived in various places for tens of thousands of years without destroying them. Kind of your descendant culture has maybe been around in its current form for 300 or 400 years, and I think Europeans and your descendant or your dominant cultures think of themselves as powerful. But think about it maybe like a individual organism, right? If you take cocaine, you can do a lot of things for a short amount of time. Right? And I don't speak from experience, by the way, I should point that out here. But it won't last, right? I mean, I think eventually, the body keeps the score, right? As the saying goes, and it will be like, okay, I think that's it, right? I think here's the wall. And I think we can think about that also, right, for the natural systems that we are, and by we I mainly mean your descendant peoples are kind of extracting at a rapid pace, right? That I think this power that kind of the European cultures that then colonized the world in the last 200 years seem to have, I think is a bit of a mirage, right? I think it really can't last, right? I think you talked about a cataclysm, and I think it has to change, and I think it's important that we see that clearly, right, that it has to change, and that also means we have to face what that means in terms of who will lose something and how we transition justly, right, how we keep, I think for example, Carl White, who is a Potawatomi environmental ethicist, he has pointed out that, for example, with renewable energies, there's the same people that already suffered in the old system, right, poor people, working class people, indigenous people, the global south, they are bearing the brunt now of this clean energy transition again, right? And that really, to me, all indicates, right, maybe going back to your question, that, right, the change we need is profound, right? It can't just be cosmetics. It can't just be we keep doing the same, kind of hierarchical kind of colonial thing, but now we do it with solar, right? I think that's not right, nuclear power. I mean, nuclear bombs that are solar powered, right, are still nuclear bombs, right? That's not. So I think the change has to be radical, but it can be very good too, right? A lot of thinkers have pointed this out, right? Like Naomi Klein, like Jenny Odell, a lot of others, right? That this is also a chance to build a better world, right? And I think if we want people to buy into it, it has to be just, right? I think when people say, right, well, I mean, if we shut down this coal-fired power plant, right, how am I going to feed my family? We have to have an answer for that, right? We can't just say, well, it needs to be done. I mean, it needs to be done, yes, but we have to have an answer for that if we want to keep or maintain or actually enhance our democracy and get everyone on board. In terms of, right, the ethics of it, I think one thing maybe we could think about, right, we need to be radically inclusive, right? And that means, well, who's excluded, right? A lot of various human groups are excluded, future generations are excluded, right? They're not considered at all in our institutions in the way we think, but also non-humans are excluded as well, right? I don't know how many people have, read some of Ed Young's work on animal perception, right? But he talks a lot about if we shifted a lot of our lights to red lights, that would really help a lot of insects and thereby birds and thereby, reptiles and amphibians. But we kind of don't think about non-humans, right? Most of the time we just kind of, we just live our lives and we just kind of let the non-human world, deal with the consequences. But to maybe say a few concrete things, right? I think if you think about, right, what is required ethically. So the first thing I think is that I completely agree, I think, with what you said and what others said, right, that we need a cultural change. It's important maybe to distinguish when you talk about ethics that it is not simply about individual change, right? I think individuals are important, but we need to talk about the structures that actually incentivize kind of bad behavior, right? I think we need to build a society where what is good and what is enjoyable can be aligned with what is right. And currently that's very hard, right? I mean, I assume everyone in this room has tried to live more ethically and more righteously in their own ways, and every single time it's hard, right? It's hard culturally because usually you're kind of one of very few people. It's hard structurally because it means, you know, you bike to work and you're putting your life in danger and you're all sweaty when you get there, right? But that isn't necessarily the case, right? There are places where you could bike to work and maybe there's a shower at work and maybe people don't try to kill you as you go there, or there's like a separate bike path, right? So first structures have to change so that people can actually be good, right? Because I think most people want to be good. I think most people want to do the right thing, but they also don't want to be miserable all the time. And I think we need to build a system that can do that. So there's the structure level, and maybe just kind of on the, I guess, more properly ethical level, I think we need to look outward, right? We need to kind of value things differently. For example, when it comes to water systems, we need to just really value the integrity of water systems. Right? This needs to be something that we, instead of just worrying about GDP or things like that, right? We need to, for example, this I get from Lynn and Fauer, a Dutch activist and author, where she says that, for example, a measure of wealth, and this aligns very well with indigenous, I think, ideas, would be drinkable rivers, for example. But that's usually not even discussed as an indicator of wealth, right? It's like, you know, the stock market or something, but who really cares about the stock market? I mean, like, I know they all pushed us, right, to have like pension funds that are linked to the stock market, but, you know, I think 95% of the stock market is really only interesting to about 1,000 people who are all billionaires. But yeah, not to digress too much. So we need to be outward looking, we need to be inward looking, we need to cultivate like virtues that actually enable us, habituate us to do the right thing, and that I think involves humility and respect, right, for humans and non-humans. It also means, for example, that we can learn from water, right? Water is not just an inanimate thing, or you know, it's its own agent, which means we can learn, for example, that everything is related, right? What somebody does upstream that will affect people downstream. It will go into, you know, the air, it will come down again, and this idea that we all separated like water kind of belies that and says, no, like look at me, I'm telling you, we're all connected. We can also, you know, like look at water and realize that we're not fully in control, because even with our best engineering, water sometimes just doesn't do what we want it to do. And that's important to realize and important to accept, I guess, in terms of, right, like who we are. And then maybe finally, I think we need to look at how we relate to each other, and that needs to include, right, fairness or justice, right? And again, that goes back, justice for future generations, justice for other humans, justice for non-humans as well. So that was maybe quite long-winded, but yeah, it's a big question.
Yeah, no, it was great. You made us laugh, so, you know, kept us entertained. And I loved this question, what can we learn from water? I have to say that Thomas gave me that question. And I'm just curious if any of you all want to respond to that as well or build on anything that Thomas said.
I actually would like to build on the idea of like systems change as an essential part of like the ethical dimension that we're looking at, and particularly what we do and don't value, because there is a very real pathway to a very specific economic kind of system change at the federal level right now. There's a proposal for natural capital accounting. It would require any government or any developmental project, for example, that the United States government is going to undertake to literally put a dollar price on the ecosystem services that they would either be augmenting or more likely than not disrupting and diminishing as a result of a development. So let's say if instead of the state of Utah and the Utah Transit Port Authority being at the behest of 9,000 acres of nature loss in outside of Ogden, it was the federal government. If this natural capital accounting law passed, they would literally have to put a dollar price on the loss of water quality and the irreparable damage to bird habitat and so on and so forth. But the forces are really against us. Even in a very supportive Biden administration, there's a lot of hesitancy from those within the system that ostensibly and actually really has made a lot of great progress for conservation federally, to do what we need it to do, to put like actual policy to systems change and cultural change, and in this case, literally valuing nature. And I just kind of wanted to point out how that's actually bleeding. The leadership against that is coming from the state of Utah, from people like U.S. House of Representatives member John Curtis, who is doing his darndest to stop us federally from being able to put a value on nature economically. And you know that trickles down into the state processes and operations relating to like what the cost of sacrificing people and sacrificing land and water could ever possibly be. And so I think, you know, that begets a bigger question then of like, what does it take to be in control? Who can and can't be in control? Like, we're probably all thinking about how you-know-who is still gonna be able to run for office, but others who have the same charges against him won't be able to vote for him or anybody else, right? And so as much as, and as true and as essential as like systems change is really essential, I just find myself in a place right now where it's like, yes, that's true, but like, where do we go from there? Like, is it more about, it's a conversation about democracy and what's right with it and what's wrong with it. So no answers, but I'll leave it there where mine's at.
Yeah, I think, thank you. I really appreciate those comments, because it really, the truth is, it's politics too, right? It's asked the question, what are we going to do? And I look at folks, some of these people who are running for Congress, they're so disconnected, okay? And so if you really want to make changes in the world, you've got to start with yourself. You have to be connected. One of the things I learned recently is the Japanese people think that salt is sacred, okay? And of course, indigenous people and many other people believe that water is sacred. The Pyramid Lake people, Paiute, oh boy, that water's important to them. So I know a woman, she uses it to bless people all the time. So if you combine water and salt, that's what, 70% of our bodies?
Yeah, more.
So we're sacred.
Nice.
Huh? Where's the disconnect happen? How do we become disconnected from our sacredness? See? There's something wrong. When we disconnect from ourselves, we disconnect from everyone. And so right now, our country is disconnected. Our leaders, all they see is dollar bills and control. And we vote for them. We put them in office. We even have someone running for Congress that's been convicted. Where is this disconnect coming from? We've all suffered a little bit of this, haven't we? It's taken my whole life to get healed. When I think of ethics, what comes to mind is that I was given horrible history when I was in school. I was told that I was a savage, good-for-nothing, cruel, killer, murderer. I didn't learn anything about my people until I got out of college, okay? And the thinking was we had nothing to offer. That taught me we're good for nothing. And also, one group thinks we're cursed. That really hurt. And I realized I had an atheist mentor who told me, don't buy into that. You buy into that, you're going to destroy yourself. And he told all of us people, kids of color at Westminster College, not to buy into that. And so I didn't. So lo and behold, I learned that my people were not starving and destitute, as the picture was described, until they were pushed out from their food source. Utah Valley, 30% of their diet was fish, Bonneville, June sucker, and other species. After we were pushed out, then we were starving and destitute. And I learned recently, thanks to Rosemary Susset, a scientist that studied the Ute people, she determined that we actually managed the fisheries. We appointed fish captains to Utah Lake, Fish Lake, and Sevier Lake to determine the spawn. That would determine how many people we would invite for the fish harvest. My people were managing resources way back then. When settlers arrived, our people were reluctant to let them fish. Before long, they were using throw nets and hauling out wagon loads of fish, shipping them to Salt Lake daily. And it wasn't long before the lake was no longer had any cutthroat trout and other species. And in a few more years, it was polluted to this day. So I guess what I'm saying to you folks is when it comes to ethics, we got to look at the truth. My people weren't perfect either. One of my ancestors was a slave trader. He traded horseless Indians for horses and for loot for himself and his band. We weren't perfect, okay? But we did have some good qualities, too. You all aren't perfect, by the way. I've lived long enough to find that out. But we aren't either. But we have something to offer.
Yeah, thank you all. Did anyone else want to add, or?
I think Olivia, I really liked also what you had to say, right, about like how daunting this is, these structural changes. And just speaking for me personally, I do think like reading a lot of like indigenous thinkers and philosophers has really, I think, changed my perspective on that, including I think what you just said, right, that I think that if you look at the history of like settler colonialism, right, it's obviously horrific and it's ongoing. But it is also, of course, a story of perseverance and of like change and ingenuity, and right that I think if you take this kind of long view, right, which I think we currently live in a very presentist culture, right, that is like completely in the now. But one of the many things that indigenous cultures have to offer is just also that they've always taken the long view in some ways, and I think it's important to do that, right? If you just think about I guess the development of the still tentative, still worthy of, still in need of improvement democratic structures we have right now, right? They're not perfect, but if you would have told somebody in Europe in the 16th or 17th century, right, that you could ever just grow up working class and, at least you'd have a shot, right, at some point being in power in some way, they just would not have believed it, right? They would have said, how is that? That's never going to happen. Or, if you would have told an enslaved, right, like African or African American, in the early 19th, 18th century, right, like one day, we might have a black president, and they again would have said, no, I can't see how that could possibly happen. And so I do think that it's important to have imagination, but maybe also have some form of faith, right? And I don't mean kind of blind faith in the sense of like, oh, somebody will take care of it, right? But that somehow if we put our if we work together to do good things and good actions, that things might happen that we maybe cannot imagine yet, right? And that things will actually happen that are good. And it will take sacrifice, and it will not be a straight route, right? I think it will zigzag, and the pendulum will swing back and forth, like we see today with civil rights, for example, but that eventually we'll get to a better place. And it's not guaranteed, but I think we can look at historical examples and say it can happen, and it'll never be perfect, but it could be much better, and that's up to us.
The other thing is we have to have a vision, right? So we want to change things, folks. We got to start visualizing that change in our heads. This is the way it's going to be, and focus on that every day, and fight the good fight. That's what I do.
And I'll add, be persistent, like, especially listening to the professor over here, and to you, like, what we can learn from water. If you want to envision, like, look at the water, look into the crystal ball, like, envision the future, be reflective, but also be persistent. And that's probably, thinking about, like, the incredible, daunting reality of having the kind of future that we need to thrive, to truly honor and respect each other and the natural and more than human world in the ways that it's needed but not given fully right now, is going to require as much persistence as it will hope and imagination. And water's got to be the most persistent thing on this planet, right? Like, water made the Grand Canyon, water shaped these valleys, water impressed, like, probably billions of tons of sand into Grand Staircase Escalante for it to be smushed, and then erased away over thousands of more years so that we can find T-Rex bones today, right? Y'all, like, water did that. And so maybe besides to move away from my my Debbie Downer reflection earlier, it's like, yeah, be freaking persistent, be like water.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm curious how we cultivate, like, really bold imagination. As you were talking about these failed bills to sort of put, like, a monetary value on water, I was thinking, well, in some ways I want us to go even further than that, right? Because that's still within, like, a capitalist framework that we value things based on the monetary value we ascribe to them. So I'm curious, how do we even go a step further? How do we cultivate imagination beyond maybe what we even know is possible right now? How do we spark that creativity? Bonnie,
I have an answer.
Ready to jump in.
I was getting kind of mesmerized just listening to you guys, and I think listening to me is the answer, and not just listening to people and viewpoints. I mean, we're not going to solve this problem without listening to farmers, for example. Like listening is really important, and demonizing is really not. And so I think my friend Nan Seymour is in the audience, and so I'll give a shout out to her because she has taught me to listen to the lake, to a voice of the lake. Also Forrest, also Darren Perry. People that point me to the water and tell me to listen has just reframed everything for me. Now, how do you turn that into policy? Then the practical side of myself gets started. But I think if everybody would listen to people and to the lake and to the system, to the resources, to the non-human animals, listen to the brine shrimp. I think it'd be great. Listening.
Yeah. Thanks, Bonnie. Anyone else have thoughts on how we cultivate bold imagination?
I think maybe what comes to mind for me, I don't know, maybe it could be characterized as a form of humility, right? In the sense of, I just look at my own, I guess, educational history. I think it's been both just studying what human societies have there been, right? What human, non-human relationships have there been, what human societies are there right now, that I think a lot of stuff that either I believed was not possible or was told was impossible over and over again already exists in some shape or form. And I think it's kind of important to also, I think this is a form of listening too, right? That we really, in a sense, going back also what Forrest, you said, right, have faith in each of us as individuals, but also have faith in just what we can do and what we can be, and see where it already exists. And then where it doesn't exist, maybe we'll just try it out, right? I mean, I think this is not quite right about the environment, but people thought that universal basic income was also something that was absolutely fantastical, and maybe it still is, and it's not without its flaws, but there are now like trial runs in various countries where people just try it out. And if people say, well, that's just not possible, you can point at this and say, well, no, people actually didn't just completely lose it and just weren't bad for 3 years. They still did stuff. They were just less stressed and they're living longer. And so I think we can do these things for ecological imagination as well, where we just see what are people already doing, what have people been doing, and that's possible, right? I mean, different cultures do exist right now that are not just looking at how can we extract things as fast as possible and turn them into lawn flamingos or something like that.
And can I just mention that the human species has been around for about 300,000 years, and our brains are not different. We're still the same. So it's not that people that lived 200,000 years ago had different brains or had different capabilities. It's just that technology builds on itself over time, whether that's diverting water or whether that's developing an iPhone, that builds over time in a society. So I think it's really important to also remember that about cultures, that my PhD is in genetics, so I think about how leveling that is, that our genes are behaving the same way, and we have slight differences, which makes us slightly different, and me a little quirky. But I think it's really important to remember the cultures we're talking about that have existed over time and currently in different places, all are using the same brain power.
Well, speaking of brain power, I want to build on to the power of listening and imagination, and just bring in the power of rest. Like for me personally, some of my greatest ideas come when I'm sitting on the chairlift or when I'm like taking a walk up Mill Creek, always on my skis. That has a lot to do with it. But more than anything, it's the fact that it's like I'm not at my desk, I'm not at work, and my brain literally has breathing room to be creative and to imagine and just come up with random wacky ideas, some of them that turned into a podcast or a rally or something. So I just, there's the incredible power of stepping away from work and resting, whatever that looks like for you, just to allow you to be creative in the first place. There's the power of nature that allows you to be creative and have that thought power as well. So resting in nature is an incredible stimulant of our imaginations. But lastly, in terms of stimulating imaginations, I just want to remind everybody to question everything, to literally walk around the room as if you were a Martian in your day-to-day life. The first thing that you do when you wake up, and ask maybe like, why is my mattress the way that it is? Why is my water coming from where it is? Why is my house the way that it is? Because the fact is the way that our systems were set up, taking the house, for example, or even the neighborhood, somebody else imagined it to be that way. Somebody imagined the maximum way that they were going to benefit from the parceling out and disposal of private property, and then the kind of structures that were going to be built on it and the infrastructures to allow people to live into it to benefit themselves. But that came from their imagination, and we were made to think that it's just the way that it is, and that's how it's always been, and that's how it's always going to be. And every new moment, every ticking second is an opportunity to say and ask, how else could it be? How else could it really differently be? And so I think a really key point of intervention in radical imagination is just to be radical, even if you don't say anything about it, even if you don't talk to anybody about it. Like, ask these what-if questions, because you never know where they can take you. I'm a very big believer in the power of like the things that you imagine, and then the things that you imagine that you especially want the most, like that's your power. That's why you were put onto this world. And so question everything is where I'd leave it for radical imaginations.
I want to say that the dominant world operates mainly out of the intellect. They've done a pretty good job. Technology, there's some bad technology too, but anyway, I appreciate the quality of life I have, so I'm not down on technology completely. But you see, the Indian world operates more out of the heart, okay? So I used to ask the question, how come we have ceremonies? And it was explained to me, well, most of our ceremonies connect us with the earth. So now, if there's disconnect between the head and the heart, if it continues to spiral out of control, it'll lead to neurosis and eventually psychosis, okay? When you separate the head from the heart too much, that's when people start killing each other, as they disconnect from the conscious heart, the spirit. Well, so I figured out the key is to keep the connection with my head and heart in balance, and then what keeps that going is connection to the earth, to nature. So what happens is I connect from nature, my heart, my mind, and then to the heavens. And so it creates a holistic being, okay? That's what I've learned from my culture. To you, my white brothers and sisters, I appreciate your power here, but don't ever disconnect from here, because I think that's what's happening. That's where the disconnect is coming from, and that's why some of these politicians are such hard asses. They've disconnected. They need to be kind, loving people like Jesus. I'll end on that.
Thanks, Forrest. Chandler, do we have time for another question, or do we need a transition? Okay. Well, we can open it to the audience now. Are there any questions?
Does this thing?
Thank you. Sorry to do this, but I guess it falls to the geezers among us to ask the tough questions. How would you reconcile population growth? In this area, it's reportedly the highest in the U.S. for urbanizing tendencies, with water and the other variables that you're addressing in this community.
I'll just start this, but I don't want to be the only one to answer. I recently went back and reread work by John Wesley Powell and his presentation to Congress in the 1850s, and he had spent a lot of time with indigenous people in the Southwest, and he said, these 6 main points, but to summarize them, it was basically, if you're planning to take this many people out west, it's never going to hold that capacity of people. And if you do this, you have to follow certain rules that he had learned from the people who already lived there. And one of those was that you shouldn't dam water, and you should never have another was you should never have a private entity own water. And there were some other things, but I think those instructions came from the indigenous people of the Southwest, were brought to our Congress by the white person they sent out to get that information, and then it was ignored and he resigned. So I think we continue to break those rules in the West. We continue to promise water rights that don't exist. And I don't understand that, except that I think the problem that we are going to have a hard time getting over here, and I can't imagine a way around it, is greed. And I just see that. I see that everywhere. That's the big thing we can't get around, right? So are we going to say no to more corporations bringing their companies and bringing people to Utah? Like, where's that incentive to, to say our population's big enough, we can't hold enough people here, we don't have enough water. There's no incentive to do that in a greed-based system.
I think like any other problem, we've got to talk about it. We've got to have a dialogue. I mean, this racism issue, we've got to sit down and talk, get to know each other. If we don't communicate or learn anything about each other, it's going to continue. See? And the population issue, most people have common sense. There's a few who don't. But you gotta explain it to them. I mean, I see my ethnic brothers and sisters having all these kids too, and it kind of concerns me. People of color, my own brothers and sisters, that concerns me. But no one's talking to them. No one's talking to them. If they do, they're pointing fingers, and that won't work. So that's just what I suggest.
I'm channeling my inner Disney villain who's saying, I want it all, to instead say what I truly believe, which is we can have it all. I do believe that we can have whatever kind of population growth, whatever kind of our silicone slopes, whatsoever, that's bringing a lot of people here on top of just natural population growth, with a radical change, an imaginative, even market-driven change in how we're building our cities and our systems. Like, I don't think anybody who's moving here is asking to live in a place like the suburbs of Stansbury being built upon the Great Salt Lake wetlands. Like, I don't think people want that. So who's telling Ivory Homes or whatever kind of developers, like, this is what we want. We want the cookie cutter house with the lawn and the flushing toilet and no water recycling and reuse whatsoever. And then, I'm not educated enough to say about like the water involved in the kinds of companies that are coming here, but there's a lot of water involved in like data farming and all of that, a whole lot of resource use in the industries that are being cited here. But, just the thing that breaks my heart the most every day when I go back to my grandparents' or my Tia and Theo's house for the weekends for our campouts and our cookouts is to see these developments popping up little by little. And that's literally the active loss of nature that we're facing, a football field's worth of nature diminishing in the United States every few minutes. Another way to look at it is like a death by 1,000 cuts. And I'm asking, why the heck are we building these suburbs outside of Stansbury, Utah, instead of like putting a tower in the middle of Tooele where there's already bike lanes? And why don't we have the gray water infrastructure to cycle? So when I think about population growth, I don't necessarily see the people coming here being the problem. It's the cost, the demand, and what the demand costs based off of how the system is set up for residences and water consumption. That is more of the immediate problem. I don't, and when I say I think we can have it all, like that's obviously for a limited time. We won't always control and can't control how much water we're gonna get year to year. And there's a lot of uncertainty in the future, but I think we have a long, long, long stretch way ahead to say, like, these are the things that we can do in our daily lives to maximize water conservation. And that's going to lead us to a place where there's plenty to go around.
We're going over time, so I don't know, Brooke, if you want to wrap up with a final question or final thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I can. There is one more question that I did want to ask you all. And if you all have more questions from the audience, these folks might be able to stick around and answer too. But I just wanted to end on kind of an imaginative note, and I'm curious if, and the audience can join in this too, if our panelists can close your eyes for a minute and imagine 100 years from now, we've changed our relationship to our waterways in the Great Salt Lake and Colorado River basins to be a relationship of care, respect, reverence, reciprocity. What does that future look like? Taste like, smell like, sound like? What do you feel on your skin? What do you imagine? And when you're ready, you can open your eyes.
Sure. I think what I kind of, well, first, I think I don't hear any traffic noise, I think, in that world. And I see a lot of people in that world. Like, I'm noticing, maybe also coming from Europe, whenever I go back there, I realize that it's as if a weight is lifted when I'm back in cities where you see people out there's a public space, right? Which I think Salt Lake has in places. But the way the city is constructed, it's extremely difficult, right? Like in public transport, other places, you see a lot of homeless people, which is a problem of its own, which doesn't exist in this future. And I think maybe to just tie it all to one feature that I see in this society, it's a society of profound reciprocity. And this is also something I read in various indigenous authors, including Patty Croick, who talks about, right, that maybe wealth means not the capacity to amass a ton of material goods. Maybe wealth means to know that if you fall in hard times, you'll be okay, right? Because people will be there and non-humans will be there. And I think if people are no longer afraid that if they don't amass things, they might end up on the streets and sick and dead, they might be a whole lot more willing to actually, hear about the environment, because they're no longer scared that maybe this will take the little bit that they carved out of this material wealth from them. So I think that's what I'm seeing.
Thanks, Thomas. Anyone else want to share before we close out?
I think my future vision is almost like the image that I imagine when people first came into Utah. So as the last ice age was melting and things were warming up and humans were moving around, and the first evidence we have of people coming into Utah is about 13,000 years ago when Great Salt Lake was formed. And I love that it never existed without people. I think that's a pretty neat concept. It's always had a relationship with people. But I also know that at that time, the aquifers were full. They were bubbling over because we just had evaporated Lake Bonneville. And so the water table is so close to the surface, and the rivers are flowing, and there are fish, and there's people fishing, and people living with this close connection to the lake. And I think when I have imagined the most beautiful future for Great Salt Lake, it looks a little bit like that.
Yeah, thank you, Bonnie.
There's a tribe up in British Columbia. Their name is Dene. They're Dene, related to the Navajo and Apache, but they have a different name. I can't remember the name of it, but I met their leaders last week, and their goal is to care for every member of the tribe. That's their goal. And it's not easy, but that's their goal. And they were sharing with me what they're doing to accomplish that. I was really impressed. They depend on the elders for their guidance and advice. And they do what a lot of Indian people used to do long ago is, if they had a problem, they would sit down and talk about it. It might take days, it might take weeks. In fact, the military were always upset with the Indians because they couldn't make a decision right away. Well, the difference is that if they take their time and make the decision, it's solid. That's it. Whereas if you make a quick decision, sometimes it wasn't a good decision. They change their mind and get angry. So it hurts me to see a lot of these homeless people out here. I see people walking around in fear. So how long can I be here before they run me out? And it's like that kind of stuff, not good. So I think if we visualize some of what you visualized and know that it's going to be difficult, but make that our vision, maybe we'll get a little closer. We'll get a little closer. And I don't know. Maybe it'll improve the quality of life of all of us. We don't know. We might have to give up something, though. I'm not sure we can have everything. We might have to give up a little bit in order to help others. So that's what I envision.
Thank you, Forrest.
What I envision is not something you can see, but it's something that I can feel. It's very simple. In 100 years, future me is, I wake up, maybe I'm a little grumpy, but I'm definitely very thirsty and not fully awake, so I go to the sink and I turn on the tap of water as I look at the sun peeking through the trees in front of my window. And the thing that's different is I say thank you in my sleepy, tired, grumpy mood. And that's what everybody does. We're in a state of mind, we're in a state of relationship and of being, of gratitude with everything that is responsible for our life. And so I think like what that concretely looks like or words to put onto that is the rights of nature and personhood for nature, personhood for Great Salt Lake, a world where we don't view food or water or other things in the world as resources, but as relatives.
Thanks so much. That's a great note to end on. And thank you, all of you, for being here. Thank you to our panelists. I'll just say outside there's info about the call for submissions for the larger book project. I have some stickers and magazines and little postcards you can take if you want to get some issues of High Country News. And then I think the library is open until 9 p.m. if you want to check out the Lake Facing Stories exhibit I mentioned at the beginning down there. Thanks so much to Chandler and Emily for all their work to make this panel happen. And
let's give it up for the panel, too, you guys. That was amazing. That was like the best conversation I've ever heard. Thank you guys so much. And thank you, Brooke. That was awesome. Yeah, like Brooke said, we've got a ton of posters. I hope that some of you are considering submitting. There's details. You can find them on the back of the smaller sheets, or there's a QR code. We will be receiving submissions through September 22nd, and then putting together the publication for early 2025 is our hope. But we have a lot of posters, and we would love your help sharing them. So if you have any communities that you're a part of, or places you go, or people you know, we would love your help getting those up around town. Anything else? Is that all? Okay. Thank you guys again so much for being here, and thank you.